I'm Ann Alexander. I'm the Associate Provost here at UW and formerly the International Programs Director for, I don't know, almost 10 years. UW alum. There's a nice, full, wonderful bio in your programs if you really want to read it. But I am mostly here to chair and facilitate this fascinating discussion here, the international careers in the public and private sector, international business section. So I'm really honored to be able to introduce these two gentlemen that are sitting here with me. Kip Coddington is the director of UW's Carbon Management Institute, which is part of our School of Energy Resources, which he joined in 2015. He moved here from Washington, D.C. after a long and distinguished career there, as well as internationally. And I'll let him talk a little bit more about some of his international experience in just a moment. And over here to my left, your right, is Laurent Roux of Gallatin Wealth Management, LLC. And he has also had a long and distinguished career in international finance and international business, and currently runs Gallatin Wealth Management out of Jackson, Wyoming. And he thinks he's going to drive home after this if the storm lets him. So, we will. Why don't we start off here and ask Laurent if you wouldn't mind. Maybe, how did you get here, besides the fact that Jean has asked you to come?
Thank you for the introduction. Just as a matter of record, I went to CU. I didn't go to UW, so nobody kill me. But I've had a few of those rides home from Boulder to Jackson where you can't see 20 feet in front of you, so I'm not worried. You're right. The reason I'm sitting here is because I got hoodwinked by Jean Garrison into participating and learning more about the Global Studies program, which has been really very interesting, very enlightening. But what I would share with you all is this: the education piece and where I'm coming from and why I'm sitting here. I was born in Switzerland in 1954, and my parents are Swiss, and we immigrated to the U.S. in 1959. My dad had a fellowship at Harvard to do prenatal research. He's one of the founding fathers of perinatology, if you're familiar with that. And we lived in a couple places back east, and then in 1966 we got in a car and did the family station wagon thing, ended up driving into Jackson. The ski area had just opened, and it was pouring rain. It was August. It was really ugly, and my mother was looking out the window saying, you know what? It's really fantastic here. So that's our link to Jackson. Now, what happened to me is I always wanted to be a lawyer, like you, sir. And I became a lawyer in 1980. But then I got a call from a family business relative. And the family business was situated in Geneva, Switzerland. And it was one of the big private Swiss banks. So if you want to talk about the gnomes of Zurich and what they do or don't do and whether or not it's a bunch of hogwash, I'm happy to do that. It's a whole different planet. But basically what happened is that I got a call in the middle of the night. My cousin Charles said to me, Roux, you don't know me, I don't know you, but you need to send me a CV. And we'd love to have a chat with you. And when I was in law school, I wanted to be in international law. And at the same time, as fate would have it, I got an offer from a law firm in Geneva, which was the biggest international law firm in Switzerland at the time. And they were looking for somebody there was a Swiss guy who could speak French, because my French is like my English, and who could actually work in the Anglo-Saxon space, but work for a European firm. So I would share 2 points with you all. The first one is fate and luck, okay? Everybody that's still situated here right now, and thank you all for staying to hear the three of us at the end of the morning. Fate and luck, everybody's got to have some, and luck is something that you make for yourself because you go out and try to see, to the conversation that Nadia had this morning about networking, for example, you have to go out and try to make your breaks. If you sit still and wait, nothing's going to happen. So that's the first thing I would share with you. Fate is fate, for whatever it's worth. But anyway, so I went through this interview program in Switzerland, and I got the green light, and they wanted me to basically be the international business development person, so I wasn't sitting in Switzerland. So I was in Asia and Europe for 25 years, And I was in the asset management, wealth management world, and built about 2/3 of the offices that we have. The firm now has, and I don't work for the firm anymore, by the way, I retired in 2005, but the firm has 31 offices, and I think I built 18 or 19 of them. So case in point, I was in Hong Kong and Singapore for 10 years, from 85 to 95, and that was a mind blower. So for you all that are sitting here thinking about international, here's what was a mind blower. At CU, I was a double major in history and poli-sci. And on a whim, I took 2 semesters of Chinese history. And it was like, Chinese history, this would be interesting. I took Russian history, this, that, and the other thing. I don't think I'll ever use it, but what the hell. All of a sudden, I end up in Hong Kong. And I'm trying to build a business from scratch. And I start using my Chinese history. And if you think back to the late 80s and the early 90s in Hong Kong, there was a thing called the 1997 handover back to China. And a lot of people in Hong Kong were trying to figure out what was going to happen when China took over Hong Kong. So the whole thing about harmony in China and how that matters to the Chinese, what's going to happen to a dynamic group of business people that are Chinese in Hong Kong when they have to deal with, and they've been dealing with a British legislative political situation, and they're going to go into China, into that Communist Party game, and make no mistake, the Chinese are more capitalist than everybody in this room. But anyway, bottom line is, my education helped me make a lot of brownie points with people that I met, because they said, oh, this white guy here, this Caucasian guy, at least he has some clue as to our culture and where we're coming from, okay? So don't minimize anything you're doing, I guess would be the moral of that pitch. Afterwards, I was in Tokyo, I was in London, I was in Luxembourg, a few other places, so that's what I did. And then I got very involved through my work in something called family offices. Family offices, for those of you who don't know what they are the Rockefellers, for example. They have an office in New York that runs all the family's affairs, business, investments, budgeting, accounting, pick a subject, this office runs their lives. But the office also helps this family stay together as a family, and they've been able to do that for over 120 years, all right? Now, Anderson Cooper is a Vanderbilt. The Vanderbilts and the Rothschilds in the 1870s started out life with the same fortune. By 2003, 4, and 5, the Vanderbilts were not together as a family. The fortune had been splintered out, but the Rothschilds, they have 3 branches. They're all still multi-billion-dollar families, the 3 branches. And the reason why they were able to do that is because they had a plan, just like the Rockefellers have a plan. That plan is in simple English called governance. So it's basically like a constitution that helps the family stay together. So when I was doing my thing in Europe and Asia, I got involved with a number of these family offices, and it took me to another place in terms of my learning, which was what matters to these families? How do they stay together? What enables them to stay together? What does it take? So I did a lot of homework through books, articles, research written by family business advisors, which then gave me some thoughts about how to deal with family issues like stewardship, responsible ownership of wealth, trying to keep the family together. The family wealth is not just the money, it's about the people, the human intellectual capital, the education they get, how they're going to fit into the family. So for you all as students, you are the next generation in this family thing that I'm talking about. How does the family actually deal with you, listen to you, allow you to pursue your own dreams, become your own person, do your passion thing in terms of what you're going to learn and do by way of work and your lifestyle? So I got all involved in this stuff, and pretty soon I got to a place where I couldn't do only that. So I put in my retirement papers, and I left Europe, and I got out of the international space after 28 years, and then came back to Jackson, and I set up this wealth consultancy business that I do from there that works with families on all these different things. But then I also still manage money for my family and some friends that sit on boards, which brings me to the last point, which would be each, and the first panel brought this up really well, each thing that you do allows you not just to build a network of links to different people, but it enables you to learn and to grow. And if it's constructive, it's going to open up something else to you, which you shouldn't fear. I think that's maybe my last point is, based on who you are, what you've learned, and what you think you'd like to do in life, have no fear. Put the decal on the back of your car, but have no fear. And the last point would be, you may have a specific goal, but all the people I know, including myself, that like, I'm going to be a lawyer, and this is what I want to be. I wanted to do that when I was 15. But then when I finished law school and became a lawyer, it's like, there's some parts of this I'm not sure I'm loving. But it enabled me to do all the other things I just told you about. So don't get stuck in a rut where, like, this is the only thing I want to do. Have the flexibility to play a little bit. Don't go too far out of your realm is what I'm trying to say. But don't have any fear. Thank you.
That was really very cool. And now, Kip, would you mind telling us how you got here?
Absolutely, I will. So thank you so very much. Actually, my remarks will be quite brief because I wholeheartedly endorse the comments of my fellow panelists. So I assume everyone here is interested in doing something internationally, correct? You're all students, you want to work abroad, you're pursuing international majors. So I would add to the fate and luck and risk-taking comments that my fellow panelists made and add the following. Don't be beholden to your degree, and that no one is going to take care of your career other than yourself, and that's kind of the risk-taking point. So I did not have the luxury of being born in Switzerland. I was born in a small town in Ohio. Actually, it was a steel town, kind of reminds me of a coal town in Wyoming. My grandfather worked at the steel mill. My dad worked at the steel mill. I got an engineering degree, but as I say, I can barely speak English. I took 3 years of French 1. It was the worst 3 years of my life. I have no foreign language ability whatsoever, but I always felt the tug of wanting to do big, important things, and that generally meant an international stage. So I got a chemical engineering degree, not because I thought it was a path to doing international work, but I always thought I could at least get a job as an engineer. But then I went to Washington, D.C. I thought if you're going to do international work, by golly, Washington, D.C. is a cool place to be. So I literally just picked up and went. And that is different than growing up in Laramie, because here you have this wonderful university where you have these international opportunities sitting before you. I did not have those opportunities before me in the small town I grew up in Ohio. So I went to where I thought the action was. I did a brief tour of duty with a government agency that was helping to fight the Cold War. And then the Cold War ended, and by the way, I got that job with a chemical engineering degree, no foreign language ability, so you can be surprised what you can do internationally without what you might think would be the typical credentials for that sort of work. So if you want to do international work, do it, pursue it, go to where it is, and don't think you need a master's in foreign affairs from Georgetown. And don't think you've got to go through the Foreign Service at the State Department. There are ample opportunities to do international work regardless of your degree. So I did go back to law school at night and then went through a series of firms in Washington, D.C., and I ended up with a firm that was getting ready to open a London office, and they were looking for volunteers or suckers to go to sort of be the vanguard. And that's another moral to the story. Opportunities come up. You'll create chances will appear, and go for them. Don't wait for your boss, or in my instance, the managing partner, to say, hey, we'd really like you to do this. Raise your hand and go and do it. So I picked up and went to London with no office support, lived in an apartment for several years as this firm tried to get its infrastructure up and running. And while in London then, that led to international transactional work. So this was when you've probably all heard of the Kyoto Protocol, the International Climate Change Treaty. Under the Kyoto Protocol, investors, including family offices in the US, were able to invest in clean energy projects, typically in the third world or less developed countries, and generate what is loosely called carbon credits, although that's not the precise term. But we would go around and monetize greenhouse gas emission reductions and sell those into the London carbon markets. So we did wind farm projects in Africa, biomass projects in Africa. We did hydropower projects in Peru, and all of that involved a great amount of international travel. But then I have to tell you, the crowning achievement of my international career, if you can call it that, is coming to Laramie, Wyoming. And I mean that in all sincerity. I considered myself to be an international guy, but I've done much more international work in the past 12 months here in Laramie than I have the rest of my prior career. I've met more Chinese delegations here in Laramie than I have the rest of my life. I've been presented with much more interesting big energy carbon dioxide reduction projects here in the good old state of Wyoming and in good old Laramie than any place else. And I guess I would just close with that. So I said, don't be beholden to your career, don't be beholden to your background, don't feel like you need to be fluent in Spanish or pick your language to do this kind of work. Don't feel beholden by your geography as well. Because generally, no matter where you are, you can find your own path, and there'll be businesses and opportunities that will present themselves to you, and you just need to seize them with all due force. And those are my remarks. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to ask you guys a couple, maybe a question to chew on and think over a little bit. I will say I've loved everything that I've heard so far. Raising your hand and volunteering, that's been half of my life. My boss, Mark Wall, I worked for him at the State Department. Just out of one day, I saw a thing come across email that was, hey, apply for the AAAS Science and Diplomacy Fellowship. I'm an economist. That doesn't really sound like something that an economist would do, but I decided to try. I ended up getting a fellowship with the State Department, and I worked for Mark Wall and the Economic Policy staff in the African Affairs Bureau. So just exactly which these gentlemen are right on. Go where it is. Get outside your comfort zone. These are exactly what these folks need to hear, I think. And that fate and luck are a lot of, fate is kind of outside your hand, but luck is what you make of it. I think that's a really good observation.
There's one other thing that I would share, which I hope all of you do with your parents, or can do with your, there's something else I would share with you all, which I hope you can do with your parents, which I've done with my kids. I want to use my son as an example. So my son is a water engineer for an engineering firm in Jackson. He's 31 years old. He was born in Switzerland. He was raised in Hong Kong in Europe. And he went to Bates College in Maine. And when he was done, he was sitting there kind of going, Jesus, I don't know what I'm going to do. And he's a biologist. So we had a couple conversations, and he said, what I think I'd like to do is go back into the international, but I'm not quite sure how I want to do that. Then he got a call from a buddy of his in Switzerland who'd started an internet company. So he said, I think I'm going to go there for 6 months and just kind of figure this all out. And I said, okay, well, that's a start. Go for it. And off he goes. So when you're born in Switzerland and you are a male, guess what? You go into the military immediately. Like the second month you're there, they call you, they write you and say you're in. So he did his Swiss military service for a year. And then he started thinking about what he wanted to do next. So he joined the Peace Corps. And he went to Burkina Faso in West Africa and spent 2 years there. And then he got done with that, he said, you know, I'm really interested in engineering based on some things that I did with the Peace Corps. And I'm thinking I might go to engineering school, grad school. So he went to Golden, the School of Mines. And he had a specific idea as to what kind of engineer he wanted to be. But an opportunity popped up where he could get a grant and do a bunch of work in the field of water. And you know what? That's what he's doing now. And he loves it. So, you know, you think about that example in terms of, you know, the flexibility piece and how you kind of have to go with the flow sometimes. Don't fall out of your realm, like I said before. But I think that it's important to be a little flexible. And I think the other thing that's really important is if you can have conversations with your families and try to get the wisdom, you know, from your parents. Or if not the wisdom, but some analysis, or where they try to get you to think and share with you, not that they tell you what to do, but, you know, where they actually get you thinking so that you can, you know, make up your own mind. It has to be your own deal. It can't be their deal, I guess is what I'm saying in bad English.
That sounded pretty good to me. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I just entirely agree. We're very much on the same wavelength. Yeah.
Well, let me give you a question to think on here and maybe to react to, and then I'd like to open it up to questions from our audience here. But you made a comment as we were coming into the room that times of great change also bring great opportunity. But it's hard to know that as you're walking into them, which ones are going to fail and which ones are going to be right. What do you think your biggest risk was that you took in your international life and that worked out or maybe didn't work out, but you learned a lot from?
Well, the first risk was beating my head against the wall as to whether or not I was going to leave the legal profession and go into the wealth management business. And that took me 3 weeks of self-analysis. I mean, I was just like this for 3 weeks. Then I finally drew the line and said, okay, that's enough. But the more interesting one, which reminded me of a comment that you made about, you know, stepping up and don't wait on your boss. The firm that I was working for said, look, you helped put together the London office, and so it's been up and running for 5 years. We'd like you to go in there and take it over and fix it up or do a couple of different things with it. And we're looking at a couple other things. And I said, well, where are those other things? And they said, Asia. And I said, well, what do you want to do? Because if you want somebody to go out there, I'm ready to go. I'll do it, and I'll start from scratch. So I packed up my bags with my wife and my son, who was 1, and we had no clients and no office, and it was all risk. And they said, look, go out there for 2 years and see whether or not it works. So I was lucky in the sense that the firm was going to give me that possibility to try to make a go of this thing, but they wanted to see a business plan before I left, okay? There was some diligence that had to be done before I went, and I had to put a plan together, and we did discuss that. But we had absolutely no idea, this was back in '85, we had absolutely no idea what would happen and whether or not it would work. It was a great risk. It was the most interesting 10 years of my life because China was taking off like a rocket ship, and Southeast Asia along with it. And from a multicultural learning place, you know, working with the Chinese around Southeast Asia and more importantly in China, absolutely mind-blowing, great learning experience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I think some of the other points relative to the risk-taking are, how do you actually measure the risk that you're ready to take? Think about that concept, okay? And you need to sit down and think analytically about who you are, what you're capable of, and have some realism. You know, the self-awareness concept is really important at that point because you have to believe in yourself on the one hand, but you also need to be in a place where you're not like, is this over my head? I mean, is this completely out of my realm or not? And I think if you can find that balance, then you can make a success of the risk without getting killed.
I would definitely add to that. And on the risk-taking point, I would phrase it that always have a backup plan. So always take smart, educated, professional risk, but don't be stupid. So it doesn't always turn out, and have a backup plan. So I told you this romanticized notion, oh, I was a carbon trader in London, but it did not end well. And so now I will tell you the end of that story. So I was over there a few years before the financial collapse, or the new Great Depression, or whatever that term was for the event in 2008. So my big law firm ultimately decided not to open a London office. The London carbon markets collapsed. So I'm over there in a lean-to, like, hey, I'm still here. I had induced my family to make this move. My daughter was enrolled in the American school in London. She was going to go to high school there. And lo and behold, they came over that last trip, and I was like, sorry, we're on the ship going back. So go into this with an open eye that it does not always turn out. Have a backup plan, that builds scar tissue, creates more opportunities. Never let a challenge like that deter you. Just pick up and keep going. But again, at every point in my life where I do think I've been a risk taker. Actually, I'm still kind of a risk taker in this job, because my wife is still back in Virginia. She has not yet come here. So again, sort of always have a backup plan. So don't be afraid to take that step, but be smart about it, and don't be deterred if things don't go as you anticipate. And one last thing, and I do think it's easy to get a romanticized notion of the life overseas. Oh, it's going to be visiting museums, and I'm going to be learning French and all this stuff. But it can be a challenge. There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of books written on the expat experience, about the emotional turmoil of just getting used to a new climate. And I have to tell you, I told you I took 3 years of French 1. I would never have coped in Paris. I was actually struggling in London, where they were speaking the same language. And I know that sounds odd, but after a while, I would sit there after 8 hours communicating with colleagues in England, and I love the English. My dad fought in World War II. I have a romanticized notion of all that. But that was mentally taxing, listening to 8 hours of British English or whatever. I mean, what's that phrase? A common people separated by whatever that phrase is. That was hard. I would go home and just, sit on the couch, wanting to speak with an American that I could understand. So there are also tax consequences. Here I'll defer to I think the United States is one of, if not the only country that taxes its citizens wherever they are. There are actually a lot of Americans who are, not a lot, there are some numbers who are renouncing their American citizenship because they don't want to deal with the Treasury Department obligations of an American overseas. That was starting to come on when I was in London. You had to find a bank. If you were dealing with a bank, that bank was going to have to be reporting back to the IRS. So again, look overseas, do it, but don't assume you're going to like it. You may not. So have a plan to come back.
Well, I said I'd take questions, but I'm going to ask you one more, though. So this actually brings up a really good point that both of you, I think, can speak to, and that is that even if you're in Canada or Britain or, any sort of English-speaking country, there's still a certain amount of culture shock and cultural acclimation that has to go on if you're going to be successful in business.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about how you...
I want to share something with you all about the culture thing. To my Chinese history conversation, no matter where you go, the biggest challenge, whether you're a Frenchman coming to America or an Italian going to Japan, whatever, the cultural challenge is there. And to the point of the expats, one of the things that you'll find historically is that expat communities, not just American, but of all nationalities, they tend to come together in these foreign countries that they sit in. And if you really want to learn and you really want to be part of, then you have to get out of your comfort zone, and you need to make an effort to know the culture, understand the culture, learn the culture, and be part of that culture. If you don't, you're going to make a big mistake. Now, there was something about the culture thing. the third year I was in Hong Kong, two of my biggest clients, Chinese families, the patriarch in each of those families said to me, Roux, you're getting to be really dangerous. And I said, what? He said, Roux, you're getting to be really dangerous. I said, why? He said, because you're starting to think, function, and act like us. And when you hear that, it's like, wait a minute, I think I just went through the cultural barrier. Something happened there. And you can't put any money on it. I remember coming home to my wife those 2 times and saying to her, you will not believe what X told me today. And for me, it was like huge, because I was actually fitting in and being a part of this thing, which makes it all the more real and all the more interesting. So, you know, I think that cultural question is absolutely huge when you go international. The one thought about the tax thing. If you were to get a job tomorrow at Procter & Gamble and they sent you somewhere in the world, as an American, you get taxed on everything everywhere. But President Reagan, who was a big globalization person, who believed the world would become very globalized to the extent that it is now, helped push through legislation where the IRS gives you, in those days, it was a $70,000 exemption. You know, the first 70 grand that you made wasn't taxed, okay? Now, you're going to be taxed at the local level in the country that you're in. So, for example, if you were in Hong Kong like me, it was a flat tax at 17%, and that's it. And when you hear the politicos say, you know, if you had a flat tax, it's like one piece of paper, my tax report in Hong Kong was one piece of paper, 2 sides. But my U.S. tax was 1.5 inches thick, and I was paying 43%, okay? So bottom line is, you know, the tax thing and the money thing, when you're about to graduate and you're going into the international realm, don't get lost in all this stuff. Get lost in what you're going to do and what the potential is for your future and what you're going to learn.
Anything you want to add?
No, I agree.
Okay. Complete agreement all around. So that's wonderful. Well, let me open the floor up to questions.
Absolutely. And actually, my wife, until recently, has worked. So we did the kids and daycare thing. We were definitely a dual income family. And yeah, I don't view this as about me. I would have followed her. She grew up overseas, was an oil and gas brat. She was in Singapore, Libya, Norway. Her father was a geologist with ExxonMobil. So yes, I would have readily followed her. And that said, I'm a guy who married up. I clearly married up. She was very understanding. And if we did not have that dynamic going, then all of these little ventures could have met a very different end. But I don't view it as a gender thing at all.
I would agree with that, and I would add that it's a team thing. And you know, when you get married, I mean, there's a partnership being built there, right? And so everybody has to agree. But I've seen situations where a spouse said, I'm not going. And that hurt the individual's career. But there's also another extreme, which is quite often you'll find that one of the spouses burns out on the international. So like in my case, I lived it. My wife at 20 years walked out the door, and she said, I've had enough of this. I'm not doing it anymore. I'm out. And she walked. So that it'll happen. But you don't have to necessarily stay abroad as long as I did either, maybe.
How long were you in China before you made that cultural breakthrough and that
3
your
years.
client gave you that compliment? 3 years?
3 years.
Yeah.
I just want to ask about changing into categories of careers. Like, I would like to ask your son how he was doing all that, but I guess you can help me out with this. Like, there is a moment when you feel like, are you doing the right thing at the right moment? And when you feel like, okay, what I'm doing now, maybe I can switch to this because of opportunities or circumstances, and you feel like it's not working well, and you want to switch over to back to what you were doing or to something else. How is it like, and how do you feel about it?
Self-awareness. I think the big answer is how self-aware are you about who you are and what you're good at and where your capabilities lie. And if you see that you're in a place where this is not going the way it should be, you have to have the courage to be able to stand up and say to yourself, with yourself, and say, I'm not sure this is really good. I think I need to either go back to where I started or look at something else that's in that place. But you need to be I think you need to be very self-aware is what I would say.
Yeah, I would just say it's a great question, and I'll go back to the same point. Be a risk taker, but have a backup plan. Take risk when you're young. I forget what the average life expectancy is now for recent graduates, 95, 100 years maybe. You may have 10 different careers, and I'm not encouraging you to go out and jump willy-nilly from job to job. But, and this is going to sound very self-serving, and I guess it is self-serving, but do what is best for your career, and only you will ever care about your career. I've known countless people who've worked for companies, fallen in love with the company. The example, this is just hypothetical. I'm a Procter & Gamble person, or I'm an ex-steel company person. But that company, in the moment of downturn, will not hesitate to throw you out the door. So never fall in love with your employer. And I don't mean that means to say look for the first opportunity to exit, but you need to be ruthlessly focused on doing what is in your best interest, consistent with the mission of the organization. I'm not saying to go work for Procter & Gamble and then privately plot to work for some other chemical company, or a chemical company, but if you're in Procter & Gamble for 3 years and it just isn't working, then you would be a fool for gutting it out. And I also have peers my age who spent their entire careers gutting it out, the third decade, fourth decade, and they're just miserable. And I just feel sorry for them. I don't know why they didn't pull the plug 20 years ago, and they might fail in that first venture, fail in the second venture, but just keep going. That would be, I think we're saying the same thing.
I have a question for you all. I have a question for all of you. When you listen to all of this and you think about where you are right now, A, what scares you most? Or B, what is your biggest challenge when you actually think about this whole international thing? Anybody want to venture a response? Sir.
I'm always questioning myself, am I good enough? I mean, I know that there is someone better than me, and that's what scares me. I mean, am I good enough? Do I have enough courage to go in those things and just follow my goal or the thing that I want to be in the future? So that's my main fear.
That's a wonderful thought, and thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to share one with you, an experiential one that you're going to like. When I was in law school, I wanted to be in international law. I said that before. So there were a couple of firms back east that are very famous in the 1970s, early 80s in international law. And I sat in my chair and debated whether or not I was good enough to actually get a job with them. So I put my CV together when I was in law school, and I sent the paperwork out to 2 firms. One of them was Couder Brothers. And I got the letters back, and they said, dude, you're not coming here. So then I had to sit back and go, okay, what's next? And then I moved on from that, and you'll get the rejection, okay? Everybody has to understand that you will be rejected. I mean, it happens to all of us, right? So the thing you have to think about is, okay, fine, what am I learning from this? Am I good enough for that? Why or why not? And then move to the next one. But to my self-aware concept, if you've got a good education and you've made it this far, you can go a hell of a lot further. So believe in yourself. Be humble, by the way, that you'll run into a lot of arrogant people in life, right? I know this and I know that, and we've run that in our professions. Those people are going to burn themselves out. Humility matters a lot, I think, to all of us, no matter how old we are and where we're starting and where we're going. So, be self-aware, be a little humble in terms of what you think you're capable of, but shoot for the stars.
The fact that you would phrase the question that way means that you've already got it. Actually, the self-awareness of understand, and I love that term, understanding where you are, you've got it. It's the people who have the veneer of confidence. That's where you've got, and you know that maybe it's not all together. That's where you have a potential problem. So, sir, with all due respect, you've got it. So I would, I really would not worry about it.
So I was thinking about what it means to be living in another country, and for me, I'm not an American. And I think often I feel like I don't belong in where I came from, and I don't belong here, so somehow I have to belong in myself, and that's a very hard place to be in. So I'm wondering how you dealt with that. I mean, what is it like to come back from being abroad for a while, or a long time?
I'm the stereotypical small town homebody. I wanted to do international work, and I think I've done international work, but I was never going to be the hip person in Paris or the guy wandering in Cambodia fitting in. So, to me, being in London, that was almost like being in Cambodia. I mean, that was a foreign country. Again, I was struggling with the language. I wanted to do it, and I thought, we're speaking the same language, but this is very hard. So I always had a sense of home. So for me, this is home. So I liked the forays overseas, but I always loved coming home. So maybe I'm not in your case.
So let me share this with you. I told you that I went to work for a family business, and the family business was on my mother's side. So I'm born in Switzerland, educated by Swiss parents, and raised in America. Now, if my name was like Bob Jones, you wouldn't know any of this other side of me, right? Okay. So I take this job in Switzerland, and I am not the Swiss guy in the firm. I'm the American Swiss guy in the firm. And throughout my whole career, they had a label on my forehead, this guy's the American Swiss guy. So every now and again, it created a couple of challenges, and not only that, but even with my European education through my parents, and my American one, through life, my wife always calls me a chameleon, right? And so there's some of that in there. But as we go through life and age gracefully or not, we all learn a little more about who we are and who we want to be. So, like in my case, I made myself a promise when I was 19. I was moving back to Jackson, Wyoming, before I could, forget who I was, what my name was, and I couldn't do anything outdoors. And I did that at 50. And everybody has to find their space. But you have to balance those things out. And it's a challenge for sure.
I really appreciate sitting up here with you two. It was really interesting to hear your perspectives, and I think take a risk, right? You never know. You might fail, but that's the only way you're going to succeed, too, right? Yeah. So I think this was a really interesting panel.
It was a great pleasure.